Iran, Saudi Arabia, and competing rivalries in Lebanon. Prime Minister Saad Hariri resigns, angry at what he calls Iran's meddling. But did Saudi Arabia give him the push? I'm Imran Gata, and today's newsmaker is Lebanon's political crisis. Tensions in the Arab world are growing by the day. Saudi Arabia has accused Lebanon of declaring war against the kingdom following so-called acts of aggression by Hezbollah. This comes just days after the shock announcement that Lebanon's prime minister is stepping down. In a televised address from the Saudi capital, Saad Hariri resigned. He said he feared for his life before criticizing Iran and Hezbollah for meddling in Arab affairs. But Tehran dismissed the allegations, saying Hariri was pressured into stepping down by the United States and Saudi Arabia. So, what does this all mean for Lebanon and the region? Vanessa Keneally explains.
I announced my resignation from heading the Lebanese government.
It came as a shock. A televised message by Lebanese Prime Minister Saad Hariri telling his people he would lead them no more. Hariri stepped down on Saturday, saying he feared for his life. His father, also a former Prime Minister, was killed in 2005. His death widely blamed on Hezbollah.
We are living in a climate similar to the atmosphere that prevailed before the assassination of martyr Rafiq al-Hariri. I have sensed what is being plotted covertly to target my life.
The 47-year-old billionaire blames Iran and its ally in Lebanon, Hezbollah. It's no surprise that Hariri made the announcement during a visit to Riyadh, given Saudi Arabia is Iran's fiercest foe.
I want to say to Iran and its followers that they are losing in their interference in the affairs of the Arab world. Our nation will rise up, as it has done in the past, and cut off the hands that wickedly extend into it.
But Hezbollah doesn't buy Hariri's reason for giving up power.
The resignation was a Saudi decision dictated to Prime Minister Hariri, so he was forced into it. The resignation wasn't his intention, desire, or decision.
Israel is also skeptical about Hariri's decision, but for a different reason.
Hezbollah took over, which means Iran took over. And I think this is a wake-up call for everyone. It says what the Middle East is really experiencing. It's experiencing the attempt of Iran to conquer the Middle East, to dominate it and subjugate it.
Regardless of who's behind the resignation, people in Lebanon seem bewildered. Even Hariri's MPs say they didn't see this coming. The Prime Minister took over in December for a second term, after leading the country between 2009 and 2011. He promised a new era for a nation stuck in a political rut without a government for 2 years. And he was relatively successful, bringing together all of the main political parties, including Hezbollah. Hariri also managed to keep Lebanon safe at a time when many countries in the Middle East are involved in some form of conflict. And while his resignation could deeply impact Lebanon, only time will tell the other ripple effect it will have on the rest of the region. Vanessa Keneally, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now from Beirut by Bassem Shab. He's a member of Lebanon's parliament for the Future Movement. Also from Beirut, we have Kamel Wazni. He's the founder of the Center for American Strategic Studies. And completing our panel from Boston, we have Rami Khouri. He's a senior fellow and professor at the American University of Beirut. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Bassem Shab, let me begin with you first. What a week in Lebanon. Did Hariri resign because the Saudis forced him to?
No, I think that's an oversimplification. Things have not been going well of late. As the Syrian war was coming to a close, Iranian influence has increased in Syria, and there was a feeling that Iran should have dividends in Lebanon along with Hezbollah because of the participation in the war in Syria. And we've been noticing lately some gripings from members in the government, notably from the Lebanese forces, There have been criticism from people outside the government, from the Kataeb party. Things were not going well, and I think of late we've heard references to Iran controlling the decision in Arab capitals. There were references to the resistance having the upper hand in decision-making, and it was just too much. The agreement that produced a year of stability in Lebanon when President Michel Aoun was elected and Prime Minister Saad Hariri was appointed implied some flexibility on both parties. And it seemed while Prime Minister Saad Hariri showed quite a bit of flexibility, other parties did not. And it was quite obvious in the statement that he made that the straw that broke the camel's back was the excessive Iranian influence and manipulation in Lebanese affairs.
Okay, so let's ask Kamil Wazni, was it just too much for the man to handle? I mean, to add to that, we have the Saudi Foreign Minister Adil Jubair saying it's absolute nonsense to believe that the Saudis had any influence on this decision. So was it just something that came from Hariri himself without any outside influence?
I think it was a surprise to the Prime Minister and a surprise to everybody in the country because everything was going smoothly. I was attending a conference just a week ago and he was talking about investing about 21 billion for infrastructure in the country. The all political party in Lebanon were in consensus to start a new beginning for the country. There was no whatsoever any hint that there is something is going wrong. We all know that the Iranians have some influence in the region. That is not something new. When he came in and became a prime minister, he witnessed that. We have to remember he's actually accusing the Hezbollah are behind his father's assassination, and he accepted the position for being a prime minister. So if there was a problem, he would not be a prime minister at the beginning, and he would not sign with the political party, including Hezbollah, to be in the political process in Lebanon. What happened really that there was a change in the Middle East. Daesh was defeated, almost defeated in Iraq, in Syria, and all of a sudden a lot of people felt the political process is not going their way. The fact that Hezbollah participated in defeating Daesh inside Lebanon, drove Daesh out of Lebanon, participated in the fighting of Daesh again in Syria and somewhere else. Maybe it did not suit very well with some Persian Gulf country, and we saw the sudden resignation.
Rami Khouri, either way, is Lebanon's sovereignty weakened here? If Saad Hariri is right and there's too much Iranian influence via Hezbollah in Lebanon, Lebanese sovereignty is in question. If the critics are right and they say the Saudis have twisted his arm in order to do this, well, you have a prime minister that's essentially run by the Saudis. So both ways, is Lebanese sovereignty in question here?
Well, Lebanese sovereignty has always been conditional on the consent of regional and global powers. This has been one of the peculiar realities of the Lebanese governance and political system going back to the beginning of the establishment of the country. There was always usually one strong foreign country that was a kind of patron and guarantor and mediator that looked over Lebanon and looked out for its best interests. It used to be the French, and then the Saudis were involved, the Americans were involved, Iran now plays a bigger role in part of Lebanon. And the Syrians, of course, when they ran the country for 15 years. So today there is no single foreign patron and protector of Lebanon, and therefore the country has become much more susceptible to the external meddling in its political system. But that external meddling has always been there. So I don't think there's anything qualitatively new about what's happened. We really are all speculating about how much of a role the Saudis played in the resignation of Hariri. My suspicion is that it's a combination of both of the factors that we just heard from my two colleagues, on the external impact from the Saudis and internal complications from the complexities of governing Lebanon. Hariri and the President, Michel Aoun, had some significant achievements in the last year, and the political system was getting back on track, making tough decisions that had long been postponed. But the underlying deep issues that matter to ordinary citizens were still not really fully addressed. And I think it became too much of a burden for Hariri to try to handle all of the conflicting pressures on him. And then at the same time, the Saudis, I think, were desperately looking for something in the Middle East that could look like a victory for them or a success story, because all their foreign policy initiatives have been failures. So it's probably a combination of both of those things.
Yeah, and the Saudis have not been quiet after the resignation. So let me ask you, Bassem, the Saudi Gulf Affairs Minister, Tamer al-Sabhan, the guy Saad Hariri tweeted a selfie with, said directly, Saudi Arabia, he said on behalf of Saudi Arabia that Lebanon has declared war on Saudi Arabia. By doing what?
Well, first of all, we all know that Hezbollah has launched a very vicious attack against Saudi Arabia, against other Gulf states, and without really paying much attention to the economic consequences, assuming that the Prime Minister Saad Hariri is the buffer that will maintain economic ties and money flowing. But at the same time, we've also seen major infringements on Lebanese sovereignty. When the Lebanese army was about to attack ISIS, Mr. Hassan Nasrallah said he would not allow any foreign air force to support the Lebanese army. And when ISIS was about to capitulate, Hezbollah on its own made a deal with ISIS to evacuate ISIS from Lebanese territories. And so this combination of caustic attacks on Saudi Arabia, on the Gulf, on undermining Lebanese sovereignty was cumulative. And then there was a statement by President Rouhani that no decision is made in 4 Arab capitals without Iranian agreement.
Okay, so let's
the situation becoming complex.
Okay,
yes,
so
but this is the situation.
So the Saudis see it as a sort of like death by 1,000 cuts by Iran and Hezbollah.
Yes,
Let me ask Kamil, because the same guy, Tamer Sabhan, also said, to take this further, that astonishing developments were coming for Lebanon. Now that's astonishing talk in itself. Tell me how that message will be received by Hezbollah, Kamil.
Well, first of all, I have to say this is a mischaracterization of the fact that Hezbollah put a lot of blood to drive ISIS out of Lebanon. And it wasn't for the initiative for Hezbollah, ISIS will remain in Lebanon. And my friend know that very well. The declaration by Mr. Sabhan on the sovereignty of Lebanon, this is really a major issue with the decision at the Saudi at the highest level. It seemed to be maybe another miscalculation in the Saudi part. They failed in their war in Yemen. They failed in their sanction against Qatar. Basically, they're coming after Lebanon. The fact that Saudi is far from Lebanon, I don't think too much is taken into consideration from that threat at this point, unless there is something planned with the Israeli to attack Lebanon. We have to wait and see how much weight behind this threat. But this is really a real threat against a sovereign country that they always claim they love and they want to take care of it. Lebanon never claimed that he's in a war with Saudi. Will never do that, because in the end, they view Saudi Arabia as a very important close relationship. So I don't know what is going on with the Saudi at this point, but there seems to be a chaos all over the place, internally and externally.
Right. Okay.
So we have to wait and see how much meat to that threat.
Okay, so Rami Khouri, as you mentioned, Lebanon has always been used as this proxy battleground for multiple powers in the region as they compete with each other. But as things stand right now, are we seeing more and more evidence that there's a convergence, that the Saudis and the Iranians are going to eventually collide in a big way in Lebanon?
Well, it's possible. The Saudis would probably like that to happen. The Iranians probably a little bit less so. The Iranians are pleased with the way Lebanon functions today. Their link with Hezbollah is very strong. They can still talk to the establishment in Lebanon. They just met with Hariri last week. But most importantly, I don't think the Lebanese people will allow this to happen, or the political system. Something very important happened in Lebanon in the last 10 years or so, since the Syrians were driven out, which is there has been a slow reconfiguration, strengthening, revitalization of domestic political governance capabilities, especially in the police, the armed forces, the intelligence, and the judiciary in dealing with political and terrorism and security issues. Lebanon is much stronger in that sense now. And the Lebanese political elite have clearly made it known that they're not going to get back to another civil war. Nobody wants to do that. They've done it before. So I don't think that we're going to see an internal strife situation in Lebanon. I don't think there's going to be an Israeli war with Hezbollah either, but because most of what we hear about this in the international press is pure speculation, and people just assume that in the past you had things happening in Lebanon, they'll happen again. Lebanon is very different today than it was 15 and 20 years ago.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, Lebanon in many ways is like quantum physics, isn't it? If somebody claims to know quantum physics, they're probably lying and they don't know anything about quantum physics. Let me ask you, Bassem, looking forward, right? So we have the situation with Michel Aoun left as president, the parliament speaker Nabi Berri also in his position, both Hezbollah allies. So what's the next step here? Who do you think needs to be the next prime minister to restore the balance to the force?
I think events have shown that of prime concern now is the issue of financial and economic stability. And everybody agrees, including the president and the speaker, that a figure like Prime Minister Saad Hariri is necessary to have some kind of confidence in the Lebanese system and to have some kind of liaison with the Saudis, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and the West. The relationship of the speaker and the president with the West and the Gulf Cooperation Council are not enough or not as strong as those of the prime minister to keep the Lebanese economy going. And it's no surprise that both of them now are saying that Prime Minister Hariri should reconsider. And I think if there is a resignation and the Constitution calls for consultations by the president, it's most likely that the parliament will name again Mr. Saad Hariri to be the next prime minister.
And if he takes it, Bassem, I wonder what you think of Al Akhbar's front page recently. Did you see it with the image of Saad Hariri and the depiction of him as the hostage? That's what they're calling him. I mean, he's saying there's too much Iranian influence, there's too much Hezbollah influence. If he's to be believed, they hold the levers of power right now. That's how they see him. They see him as a hostage of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries. And I guess if you take that further, the West and the United States. How do you feel about that?
Well, it is funny that those who were the most critical of Prime Minister Saad Hariri are the ones who are now shedding tears. And the other thing, this is to detract from the main issue. The main issue that the agreement on which the president and the prime minister had agreed to work included Lebanon being dissociated from regional axes and neutralizing Lebanon politically. The major issue is Lebanon has gone in the direction of the axis of resistance and will have ramifications economically. This is the main issue that Jarit al-Akhbar doesn't want to expose, that there is an undue influence that is harming the country economically, politically, and isolating it with respect to its natural allies, the Gulf Cooperation Council and the West.
Are those your natural allies, Kamil?
But basically, when we look at the situation, my estimate that Mr. Hariri is a victim of what is taken with the extremists in the Persian Gulf. This Persian Gulf countries is divided among themselves. The country in Saudi Arabia, it seems, is divided against itself. We don't know what the outlook for Saudi Arabia. They taken the pressure against Saad Hariri, and they take him as a hostage. Basically, he's really a hostage to the extremists that they want him to corner in a position against Iran and against Hezbollah, where he actually, a year ago, he decided to make peace and enter into a political process into Lebanon. As far as the political picture, we have to remember that Lebanon is a democratic state, and we have consultation, and we like to see Mr. Hariri come back as a prime minister. He has been good to the country. I'm sure he will be good again for the country. But the way the influence of the Saudi has gone too far to undermine the security of the country to the level of a threat that a minister in Saudi Arabia, he actually threatened Lebanon with a war. That's absurd. Right. That's an absurd that we reach that level. We need some cool mind to cool things down.
Right. And Rami, given that, particularly because you're in Boston at the moment, let me ask you about the American angle. Those who believe that Hariri is a hostage of the Saudis believe that Washington had to have given the green light for the resignation, and if not that Washington is at least extremely involved in this process. Are those claims overblown?
We really don't know. Decision-making in the White House and in Saudi Arabia is like decision-making in Beijing and Moscow. We don't know from watching TV who's making the decisions. It's all done behind closed doors. What we do know from the American experience, and Trump was elected exactly 1 year ago, is that the president is almost totally ignorant of everything going on in the Middle East, and his key man, his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, is mainly interested in commercial deals. So it was not accidental that when Trump called the Saudi king and said, we support what you're doing, he also said, by the way, can you bring the IPO for Aramco to the U.S. stock exchanges? So we have a really dysfunctional American foreign policy in the Middle East, which frankly is why the Russians are now becoming a big player. And I would keep an eye on Russia coming in to play a bigger role in Lebanon as it has all over the Middle East. The last point I would make is a critical development in Lebanon is the reconfiguration of the balance of power, the real balance of political power among the big sects. The Sunnis are shattered. They have fractured leadership, not very strong leadership. The Shiites are very strong under Hezbollah. Most of them support Hezbollah. And the Christians are divided. And the biggest Christian group, Michel Aoun's party, is in alliance with Hezbollah. So the internal political situation in Lebanon is no longer really a consensual democracy because the Aoun Hezbollah alliance is so strong that they can almost dictate what they want. But they also know that they cannot just take over power. They have to negotiate with all of the groups in Lebanon so that everybody feels they have a stake in the system. They just haven't figured out quite how to do it. The Hariri premiership was an important sign that there was a way to do this, and there must be serious Sunni engagement in politics. And so I think we need to look internally in Lebanon now a little bit more than externally. The Saudis are doing wild stuff at home and around the region. The Americans have no idea what's going on in the regions. The Russians are interested. The Iranians are interested. But it's really internal dynamics that I believe will play a bigger role in the period ahead.
Okay, well, that's a good point at which to wrap the conversation. Gentlemen, I've really enjoyed it. Thanks so much for joining us on the Newsmakers. Rami Khouri, Bassem Shab, and Kamil Wazni. I'll speak to you soon. Still ahead, is Israel's ruling party coming undone? Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu faces scathing criticism from his own president. And the world's worst outbreak of the plague in 50 years. We look at what's being done to stop the spread of the deadly disease in Madagascar. Welcome back to the Newsmakers. Is Israel's democracy in crisis? The country's president thinks so. Reuven Rivlin has launched a scathing attack on Benjamin Netanyahu and his government. Rivlin comes from the same right-wing Likud party as the Prime Minister. But that didn't stop him from accusing Netanyahu and his allies of trying to weaken the Supreme Court and silence the media. Now, while his presidency is largely ceremonial, his words have outraged other politicians who've called his comments dangerous and undemocratic. So, are divides in the Israeli government widening? Shoaib Hassan has more.
It was a classic picture of Israel's view of the Middle East. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressing the parliament on the threats faced by the Jewish state. But many Israelis now believe that Netanyahu's domestic policies are a bigger problem, including President Reuven Rivlin. He denounced the recent move to rein in the Supreme Court and muzzle the press. Rivlin said, "How can a threatened, conformist, toothless Supreme Court be in the interest of Israel, of Israeli democracy?" Critics agree. They say one reason the government's trying to control the courts is to prevent them from allowing human rights groups access to Palestinian areas.
Human Rights Watch on my behalf applied for a work permit so I could take up my post as Israel and Palestine Director on the ground in Jerusalem. We received a response on Monday informing us that our request had been denied on the basis that Human Rights Watch was not a real human rights organization, that instead we were engaging in propaganda and falsely raising the banner of human rights.
They also point to the ongoing investigation over abuse of power against Netanyahu. The charges include bribery and media intimidation, and have been dismissed by the Prime Minister. Benjamin Netanyahu and his Likud party has spoken out against the media and the police investigators, accusing them of being behind a campaign to oust him by left-wing politicians. His Likud party has now introduced legislation in parliament to prevent investigations against a sitting Prime Minister, even if ordered by the Supreme Court. Even some of his strongest supporters say it weakens checks and balances inside Israeli democracy and creates an all-powerful executive. President Rivlin being the most recent and prominent critic from among his former supporters. But will the increasing criticism be enough to stop the growing power grab by Benjamin Netanyahu? Shoaib Hassan, the Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from West Jerusalem is Sharon Haskell. She's a member of the Knesset representing the Likud party. And from Tel Aviv is Neri Zilber. He's a journalist and Israel analyst. I thank you both for joining us. Sharon, are you unhappy with what President Rivlin has been saying about the ruling party and the direction in which the country is going?
Well, you know, what Rivlin is saying is a political thing as well. It's always a bit sad to see political dialogues between the governments and the President Institute. But, you know, this is a democracy, and sometimes we agree and sometimes we disagree.
But Sharon, I mean, he's from the ruling party. I doubt he has any designs on becoming Prime Minister. And from what he's been saying, that the coalition is endangering Israeli democracy and the checks and balances are going away, isn't this rather the warnings of a man who's feeling disappointed that things are slipping away rather than somebody trying to score political points? Shouldn't the government be listening to him?
Well, if you look on the presidency, once he becomes the president and he steps out of any kind of party frame lines, and so as a president, he's not connected not to the Likud and not to the Labour Party. He's meant to represent the entire people of Israel. And so even when he does say his political opinions, these are some of the things that we hear from the opposition, and this is what the opposition is trying to describe. But to be honest, if you look on Israel and its democratic institutes, you understand that Israel is the only true democracy in the Middle East. And so if you come and ask me whether Israel is going to look like one of our neighboring countries, my answer would be not a chance.
Okay, sure, but I'm not asking you whether Israel is better than Syria or any other country. I'm asking you very specifically about what the president's saying. So there's two issues here. One is freedom of the press, and the other one particularly is the Supreme Court, right? So he feels that the Supreme Court is losing its checks and balances on the government. You're saying he's sounding like the opposition. This is why you dismiss what he's saying. Just because this is something that the opposition says doesn't make it untrue, does it, Sharon?
Yeah, don't forget that in any kind of a healthy democratic system, there is always a dialogue and disagreements between governments, Knesset, the media, and the High Supreme Court. It is okay to give your opinion about the Supreme Court. It is okay that the Supreme Court will criticize you as well. This is part of a healthy democracy where you have the checks and balances between those institutions. If you look on it, all of these institutes are strong institutes, and they will definitely continue to be like that.
Okay, so Neri, rather than the diminishing of the checks and balances, according to Sharon, this is a healthy example of the checks and balances at play, that the president can criticize the prime minister and the ruling coalition. What do you think, Neri?
No, I think your line of questioning was absolutely right. Ms. Heskel fails to mention that President Rivlin was sounding a warning, a clarion call for precisely that reason, that Israel's democratic checks and balances between the various institutions are being undermined systematically by this current government, and that's unfortunate, whether verbally or via legislation or proposed legislation, consistently, almost on a weekly basis. And that's what President Rivlin was warning about. And it wasn't a political message. You were absolutely right. He is a former senior Likud member. It was very much in the interest of the state, the primacy of the Israeli state and the vibrancy of the Israeli democracy. So Ms. Heskel likes to tar the president now as political, as sounding like a member of the opposition. They do this with the Attorney General. They do this with senior army officers. They do this with the Supreme Court. The media is left-wing, according to them, and on down the line. It's very dangerous, and I hope Ms. Heskel is right that Israel's institutions are strong enough to withstand it. We just don't know yet.
Sharon, are you doing this to the president and the Attorney General and the media and so on, tarring all criticism as, or rather just dismissing all criticism as not of value?
So Israel have a fully freedom of press. No one is trying to demolish that. And this is something that will still stay strong and maintain it. This is a similar thing with the High Supreme Court. We have a strong institutes of the High Supreme Court and the court system as well. What we as legislators are doing, we are bringing the will of the people in changes either to the legislations, current legislations, or bringing new legislations by the will of the people. And so when we are making changes to legislation, this has nothing to do with the High Supreme Court. This is bringing up the will of the people of how they want to view Israel in the future as well. And this is what we are changing. We are changing legislation. We are not demolishing the High Supreme Court. We make sure that it stays strong and we maintain it. Similar with the press.
Okay, and Sharon, let me read you a little bit of what Rivlin said. He said, how can a threatened, conformist and toothless court be in the interest of the state of Israel, of Israeli democracy? I can only describe what I see in what appears to be an ongoing attempt to weaken the gatekeepers of Israeli democracy. So, for example, we've seen in the past, lawmakers have done one thing, the Supreme Court has jumped in and said, actually, this is unconstitutional. Actually, we think you've made a mistake. That's what people refer to as the checks and balances of the Supreme Court. Doesn't Rivlin have a good point? He's saying if the courts are completely subservient to the lawmakers, what's the point of the democracy?
So this is a live debate that we have here in Israel. And the debate is when the High Supreme Court is actually changing legislation. It means that certain legislation that we are passing is actually being diminished by the High Supreme Court, sometimes unjustly. And so the question is whether the High Supreme Court is meant to maintain the legislation or to actually be the one who is writing or rewriting the legislations. And this is a live debate that we have. So this is, from our point of view, when we see that the High Supreme Court is rewriting legislation and inventing it, this is not his position. This is the Knesset, this is the legislator's position, and this is what we're actually doing. We are not limiting the Supreme Court power, but we are actually legislating in order to give the High Supreme Court tools to rule by it.
Right, okay, so Neri, is this merely a difference of opinion in a democracy, a healthy debate regarding the role of the Supreme Court?
No, I don't believe so. I think Ms. Haskell and her colleagues in the ruling party, in this current government...
Go ahead, Neri.
...in this current government are systematically going after the ability of the Supreme Court to rule, to fulfill its function in a democracy. So literally the Likud and its coalition partners are trying to pass legislation that would bypass the Supreme Court. By definition, that would undermine its role in the democracy. Ms. Haskell likes to talk about the will of the people. What President Rivlin and others would characterize it as is the tyranny of the majority. Majoritarian rule in a democracy, steamrolling any checks and balances, steamrolling the rights of certain minorities, steamrolling the role and the place and the ability of the media to function, and on down the line. It's not quite there yet, to Ms. Haskell's, I suppose, credit, but it's a very dangerous precedent, and that's what Rivlin was really warning about.
Neri, when you hear the Sport and Culture Minister Miri Regev say, and I quote, "A president that belittles politicians, belittles the will of the people, and hurts the heart of democracy," when you hear that, what does that tell you?
Well, it tells me that it's a pattern, and today or yesterday it might be the president, and tomorrow it will be the attorney general, like it has been, and the next day it'll be the police commissioner, and the next day it'll be the chief of staff of the army, and the next day it will be a certain journalist who writes something unflattering towards the prime minister or his family. It's quite dangerous, and I would say more than dangerous, it's unprecedented in Israeli democracy. And the Likud party, and Ms. Haskell knows this better than anybody, the Likud party was built as a liberal party in Israel. Its foundation, its building blocks were a liberal culture, both economically and also socially.
So Sharon, is Likud turning illiberal or less liberal as we go along?
Not at all. The Likud is the liberty party. We have always protected liberties, and this is the same here. If the president and if the Supreme Court have any kind of criticism about the government, about the Knesset, they are free to speak so and to say so. But it goes same way. If I disagree with the High Supreme Court, if I disagree with the president, and if I disagree with the media as well, I have the right of speech as well. I have the right to come and criticize them as well. And this is what needs to be maintained. Obviously, it needs to stay in a respectable frame. Not everything that was said, I completely agree with it, but I completely agree that every single either representatives or one of the democratic institutes or a citizen is absolutely free to criticize any kind of government institution. This is a healthy democracy.
Okay, and let me then add to what the president said, and my thanks to the New York Times for translating this. The former chief of Shin Bet, Yuval Diskin, wrote in Yediot Aronot, he wrote in that column that if the ethical and moral rot that leads us continues, this incredible Zionist enterprise will expire. He was referring to Prime Minister Netanyahu and the ruling coalition. He also believes, like President Rivlin, that things are not going in the right direction. Don't you think that it's probably in the government's interest not to just dismiss all of this and maybe to take it seriously?
Well, we are taking everything seriously, but don't forget that every single person have political views. And with the political views, they bring out their agenda. And it's the same with Yuval Diskin. He comes with his own political view and with his own agenda, and he brings it out. He's free to do so. I actually would like to see more of that. This is freedom of speech. This is something that needs to be in a healthy democracy. I completely disagree with him. I can bring you other Shin Bet's former officials and leaders and things like that that will say the exact opposite. And this is what is healthy about a democracy. We disagree on certain things.
But Sharon, what they're saying is that the very foundations of the democracy are being eroded. They're not disagreeing about allocation of funds or the occupation or you know, the military and so on. They're disagreeing about the very fundamentals that you're championing right now. You're saying this is all a sign of a healthy democracy. They're saying the healthy democracy is dying on your watch.
So I would like to actually see an example for that. And any kind of example that you will bring, I will be able to debate that, because I believe that we're actually strengthened the democracy here in Israel. And by doing that, for example, we're legislating now new legislation about the character of Israel and how we would like to see it. We're also legislating about worker migrants that the High Supreme Court has rejected and tried to rewrite a legislation about it. And so for me, when I see that, I actually see the more we legislate, the more of a stronger political and democratic foundation we create. Don't forget, Israel is a young country. The foundation of the legislation of the Israeli country is based on the Ottoman rule, on the British mandate rules, and on certain legislation that we put throughout the years. The longer it takes, the more Israeli and fundamental legislation that had meant to be happening long time ago. And this is what we're doing today. It's inconvenient for certain people, and some people can interpret it in their own opinions and views, and they can be like, you know, black prophets of as if we're going to destroy it. But the more and more the years go by, we see that Israel becomes a more democratic place, a stronger economy, a safer place. And, you know, it's a symbol of freedom and liberties here in our region.
Okay, so Neri, we have Sharon making an impassioned argument. Are you convinced by any of what she just said?
No, not at all. You know, Ms. Heskel can say that this is a disagreement and that people are allowed to express their views in a democracy. That's absolutely true. The better question is what role, what obligation really politicians, and especially people that are in government, have towards the democracy and the society and the country within which they live and which they lead. What obligation do they have to maintain certain democratic norms, certain norms of civility, the roles and functions of certain institutions? All these are very important questions that the current government, according to not just me and not just Yuval Diskin or other people, but people that serve in government at the moment, oftentimes appointed by Prime Minister Netanyahu, they are the ones issuing warnings as well. So it's not just isolated differences of opinion from people that differ politically with Ms. Heskel and her colleagues. This is widespread people coming out and saying this is a very troubling time and a very troubling trend that we see helmed by the current government. Okay. And there's nothing really that I can say to her because she has obviously differing points of view.
Okay, very briefly, please, Sharon, because I have to wrap. Very briefly, yes.
If this is the situation and it is so severe, I would like just to get one name of one journalist that was either imprisoned or forbidden from speaking his opinion. I would like to get one name of a judge that's been imprisoned or shut down or not allowed to speak his mind. And so this is not. But you're saying
that's a very high bar
that our foundations of democracy are
okay, so let me jump in here.
It's the exact complete
Sharon
opposite.
and Neri,
having a live debate about things
that's
that
great.
we disagree
And
about.
I've got to jump in here, but I thank you very much for having this conversation with me, MK Sharon Haskell and Neri Zilber. Thanks so much. See you soon.
I just need to be saved. If I must be an outcast from society upon returning home once I finish my treatment, I wouldn't be afraid.
More than 50 million people died in Europe as a result of the Black Death. That was in the 14th century. So you would be forgiven for thinking that the plague no longer exists. Well, you'd be wrong. In fact, it seems to be on the rise. In Madagascar, there have been more than 1,800 suspected cases of the deadly disease since August. In that time, more than 120 people have died. And with the plague season expected to last another 5 months, the death toll is expected to rise. The World Health Organization says it could be the worst outbreak in 50 years. And to help treat the infection, the World Bank has released an extra $5 million. But is that enough? And does the outbreak pose a global threat? Well, to help answer these questions and more, let's speak to Tarek Yasharovich in Geneva. He's a spokesperson for the World Health Organization. Tarek, good to talk to you. It's unbelievable when people hear about bubonic plague. They think of the Black Death. They think this was, long in the past. Tell me what's causing this dramatic spread and why hasn't this been stopped so far?
Well, you are absolutely right, Emran. Many people don't think about a plague. But the fact is that every year around the world where plague is still endemic, we see several hundred of cases. Madagascar is one of the countries that sees cases of plague every year and has on average 400 cases. There are other places on the planet where bacteria that is causing plague is still active, can affect rodents and small animals, and then can transmit to humans. So although we don't hear much about a plague, it is still there. The good news is that plague is responding very well to antibiotics and to common antibiotics. So people who get infected can be treated if they are put on treatment very early. Now, why this year is so different from other years? In Madagascar, it is because we see a majority of cases being of pneumonic type. This is the type of plague that is transmissible human to human. And because cases were reported in the capital and also in a bigger coastal cities, we have seen a number of cases that is bigger than usual. And there was a bigger threat of a spread on a local level.
Okay, so you have bubonic, which is a growth and fever, and pneumonic, which is, I guess, far worse, and people get more sick. This has been happening in Madagascar. It is an island, in a way, a kind of natural quarantine, but we live in a globalized world. How scared is the World Health Organization that this is going to spread elsewhere?
So just to explain to your viewers, so bubonic plague is the first stage of a plague when a person gets infected by flea bites that are carrying the bacteria. Then bacteria is circulating in the body, going to lymph nodes, and then we got those buboes that are sort of like symptoms of a plague. Now, if that is not treated, then the bacteria can enter the lungs.
Right.
And at that point, it becomes pneumonic plague, and which means that person can transmit directly to another person by air droplets by coughing. So when we see pneumonic cases of plague, it means that the transmissibility is much higher, and therefore there's a bigger risk. Now, again, we have to be very careful when we characterize the international risk. According to our assessment, the risk of infections at national level in Madagascar is high. At the regional level is moderate, and international level is low. And there are several reasons for that. One, because already Madagascar authorities have put in place exit screening measures at the airports. So people who are obviously sick will not take the plane, and people get really unwell very quickly with pneumonic plague. Within 24 hours, you will have symptoms which will make you simply unable to travel. However, the risk does exist, and that's why it is important that we continue to do what we do on the ground. And this is mainly trying to find everyone who has been in contact with people who we know were infected with the plague, and put them on prophylactic treatment. As I said, plague is responding well to common antibiotics, and if people who are suspected to may have been exposed to a person who was carrying the bacteria, we put them on a prophylactic treatment and follow them for 7 days.
Okay, very finally and very briefly, $5 million released by the World Bank. Encouraging or not enough?
this is really good news that we received from the World Bank, because we need to sustain efforts. So it is really important to say that the numbers are going down. As of yesterday, there were only 26 people in hospitals being infected. That's 10 times less than on October 20th. So in only 17 days, we have 10 times less people being infected. However, to make sure that we come to the end of this outbreak, we need to sustain the efforts. We need to have enough of protective equipment. We need to have case management facilities. We need to continue on contact tracing and the safe burials. And for this, we need funds. And that's why this donation is welcome.
Right. Well, Tarek Yasharovich from the World Health Organization, who are on the front lines in battling the plague. I thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers.
Thank you, Imran.
That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garza. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, we delve into the Paradise Papers and ask, if tax havens are legal, why are the rich so secretive about them? Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.